Hi everybody, it's Courtney, and today we are making a clean and simple card with a Kitten Christmas by Newton's Nook. And of course, I just had to have this stamp set. And so we are going to be creating, like I said, a clean and simple card, which I sometimes struggle with to kind of leave it clean and simple. So I started out by cutting out or die cutting a piece of red cardstock with a wonky stitched rectangle die and a piece of black cardstock with a regular stitched rectangle die that's just a little bit smaller. Then I'm going to measure that black panel there and cut a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock, just a little bit smaller than that. I figured being this is such a clean and simple card, and it will be very, very simple. By creating some mats for my main panel, this will kind of bring everything out, make everything pop a little bit more. So of course I measured wrong and I had to take a little bit more off, and that fits nicely. So we can move on to the stamping. And typically when I create clean and simple cards, I usually just use one or two images from the stamp set. So I'm going to use this little kitty that is hanging from a string of lights, and I'm going to stamp him right on top of my card panel there with blackout ink by Ink on 3, because of course it is a Copic safe ink. This is the first time I'm using the stamp, so I did stamp this twice just to get a bold black outline, and we'll move on to the coloring. So for the cat, I'm going to be using some warm grays, and I'm going to go right in with my darkest color, which is the W7. This is a really, really dark color, so I'm going to use this very sparingly and only put this in the very darkest areas. I'm going to leave his tummy white for now, and I'm only placing shadows where one part of his body is over another. So where his little, well, I'm calling it an arm, but the front leg of the cat is kind of hanging over the rest of his body, where his ears are kind of tucked into the top of his head. And also where his little claws would be. I'm just using the tip of my marker. You can see that my marker is straight up and down, and I only added a tiny bit of that. I also added a little bit of a shadow over his nose. Next, I can go in with the W7, and I'm going to extend these areas out a little bit further. And this one, I'm adding a little bit more color than I did with the W7, but I'm pretty much adding this to the same areas. Now the warm gray, well, all the grays blend really nicely together, so I don't feel the need to saturate my paper first. I typically just go right in with the darkest color as long as I'm pretty confident where the shadows will be. So I'm just extending these areas out, and then I will move on to the W3, and I'm going to do the same thing. Now what I like to do is I like to use all of my darker colors pretty sparingly, because I can always go back in and add more. Now I want him to be fairly light anyway, because I know I'm going to be coloring these lights that he's hanging from, and the glow of these lights are going to be directly onto his body. So I don't want him to be super dark, because then you won't be able to see that glow. So I'm extending these areas out with the W3, and I'm not leaving a whole lot of room for the W1 with the exception of his face. That's pretty much where most of it is going to be. And I'm going to go right over the inside of his ears, his nose, and the little pads on his paw. Because I'm going to be coloring these pink, I don't want them to be super bright pink. And by going over it with my lightest gray first, it will kind of tone down that pink a little bit more. Now, I didn't get as much contrast on his face, so I did end up bringing back in some of the darker colors, not the darkest, but some of the darker colors, just to add a little bit more shading to either side of his face, and I liked that much better. So next I can go in with a R20, I believe I used, and that will go for the, well, first I did the belly. I forgot the belly. I am going to color those with grays, but I'm just going to use the lighter ones, the two lightest colors. So it's a little bit different than the rest of his body. Now I can go in with that R20 and fill in his cheeks, the little pads on his feet, and his nose. So next for the lights, we are going to color these green, red, and yellow. So for the lights themselves, I'm just going to use two different colors, one dark, one light. And I started with the G03 as my lightest, and it wasn't quite light enough. So I went to the G02. Now I'm going to go around that light with a super light green, the G00. And I'm going to do that for all of them. So next, when I move on to the yellow one, my darkest is actually an orange just to get that contrast. And then I'm going to take the Y000 and just kind of outline the outside of that light, and that will make it look as if it is glowing. Now that we're getting to the lights that are kind of over top of the cat, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go directly over the coloring that I've already done, and I'm going to create that glow. Now, over certain areas of him, you may have to go a step darker so that you can still get that glow to show. Like if I were to use that, you'll see once I get to the second yellow one, I went in with the Y000 for the first light because it was just on that blank space. But when I get to this one, the glow would be over him. And the Y000 was just not showing up at all. It was way too light. So I went in with the Y11 with just a little bit darker, and that showed up a lot better. So I'm just going to continue to color the remaining 3 lights. You can see for the reds that I started out with a R29, and again, I just wasn't getting the contrast I was looking for. Not that you really need the contrast. These are really tiny little lights, but I did end up bringing in a R39 just to kind of deepen up those shadows a little bit. So now that I'm in that blank space here, I can go back to the normal colors that I used the first time around for that Y000. And then you may have some harsh lines depending on what colors you're using. So if you don't have a super light color, it's no big deal. I'm going to take a colorless blender and I'm going to go right where I left off with that glow, just in the white spaces. And that will kind of make it fade to white a little bit rather than having that really harsh line. So if you don't have a super light color, just bring out your colorless blender and tone that down a little bit. So for the, I don't know what you would call it, the base of the lights, I guess you could say, I'm going to bring out some C markers, and I'm just going to add a little bit of a shadow on either side. Now these are even tinier than the lights themselves, so you could probably get away with 2 colors or maybe even 1, but I did end up bringing in 3, and I'm just adding basically just a line on either side until I get to the center for the highlight area. So now that all my coloring is done, I can go ahead and stamp my sentiment, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp that with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and I just bring out my acrylic block. You can certainly bring back out your stamp positioner for this. This is a fast drying pigment ink, so it does take a couple of seconds to dry, but not nearly as long as most pigment inks. Now I can layer everything together. I'm going to layer this black panel onto the red and then onto a A2 size top folding card base. Now you can see the red is a little bit warped, I guess you could say. And this is because I added too much pressure in my Gemini. So if your die cuts are being warped a little bit, it might be just because you have a little bit too much pressure in your die cutting machine. I cut 2 of them at the same time. I thought I was cutting a card panel, but I wasn't. I was cutting a card base, and I think that's why it got a little bit warped. Just add a little bit extra pressure once you glue that down, and you should be good to go. So finally, to get these lights to really glow, I am going to add just a little bit of shimmer to the lights themselves and the glow around them with a Spectrum Noir shimmer pen. And finally, adding some glossy accents because I can't stop. I just can't stop. Plus, this will give it even more shine. And I'm adding those just to the lights. But that is it. That is the card. Super clean and simple. You can whip these out pretty quickly if you have a lot of Christmas cards to make. And today's collaboration is with my very good friend Leanne, who is also creating a clean and simple card. I will link her channel below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by, and I'll see you again tomorrow. Bye.